You know, about a month ago, I had a pretty proud dad moment. I sat in the stadium at Morton High School, and I watched my son, Ronnie, graduate high school, which was really exciting for me as a dad because that means I'm officially an expert now. Like I've done this, right? Like I've taken this kid and walked with him, and he became an adult. He's done. I'm done. Game over. Everything is completed at this point. And I was excited to think, wow, I actually raised a child. Like I did it. But the strange thing is that I keep coming home and he's still in my house. I mean, I'm still paying for his stuff. Like what is going on here? I have learned that and at least I hear from some of you more experienced dads, that being a dad never really stops. It's something that you keep on doing. It may look different as years go by, but being a dad never really stops. And so today I want to talk a little bit about being a dad and getting back to some basic stuff. I mean, we're going to get back to a foundational thing. We're going to look at a story that happened about 3,000 years ago. So we're going pretty far back, right? It's a story about a dad and his son. And it's a time where the dad is going to reflect to his son the things that he thought was important for him to know. It's his last words before he dies. So if you're following along with your YouVersion Bible app this morning, today's message is called Man Up. And we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 2, looking at verses 1 through 4, and then we're also going to flip to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and we're going to look at verses 13 and 14 there. So I want to give you a little bit of backstory so you know where we are in Scripture as we get to this point in 1 Kings. Okay, basically, when God made Israel, there was no original plan for there to be a king. God was going to be the overseer of Israel. That was the plan. That was the covenant. But, the Israelites, they wanted to be like everyone else. They wanted to keep up with the Joneses. They wanted to, we want a king like everybody else. And God warned them that it wasn't really going to be a good idea, but they said, we want a king anyway. So God gave them a king. And their first king was a guy named Saul. And he was a little bit selfish and a little bit haughty. He was a little bit full of himself. And he made a huge mistake, and ultimately God set it up so that he would die in battle along with his son. And so that first kingly line finished with one king. That was it. But God had another line that he was going to start up, and he brought this guy in named David. You've probably heard of him with his, when he was hanging out with Goliath there. Things didn't go well for Goliath. And so David was actually going to be this new kingly line, the second one that was going to be established after Saul. Now, for all intents and purposes, David was a good king. You might even say he was a godly king. Scripture says he was a man after God's own heart. But even though he was a godly man and a godly king, he was definitely not perfect. He made some significant mistakes, and probably his most famous one was that he had an affair with one of his soldiers' wives, a woman named Bathsheba, and he got her pregnant. Well, so he, of course, wanted to cover that up, so he brought, Uriah, her husband, back from battle and was like, hey, why don't you go hang out with your wife tonight? Trying to cover it up, make it look like it's his baby. But the problem was Uriah was a good man, and he's like, well, if my soldiers don't get to be with their wives, I feel guilty being with mine. So he abstained. So David was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do then, so I guess I better put him at the front line where he would surely be killed in battle, and he was. And so basically, at that point, we know that David was guilty of murdering his friend, someone who was very loyal to him because he wanted to cover up the affair he was having with his wife. Okay? So when you hear a man after God's own heart, you have to remember that doesn't mean that you're perfect, okay? And so basically, David got Bathsheba pregnant, and that son would not survive, along with a few other sons that he would eventually have that would also not survive. In total, we know that David had at least 21 sons, okay? So he had a lot of kids running around. And the Lord chose out of that group of 21 a kid to be king who was not the one that you would think because he was not the firstborn or anything like that. He chose a guy named Solomon. And he would become, not only was he only the third king of Israel, he would actually be the last king of Israel before Israel would split into two different kingdoms, Judah and Israel. So Solomon ends up coming on the scene, and he is, by all accounts, a very successful king. He was insanely wealthy. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He would be the wisest man to ever live, if you don't count Jesus. And he would be the one that would build the first ever temple to the Lord in Jerusalem. So Solomon would accomplish a lot of things in his kingship. But today, what I want to do is I want to look at Solomon's dad, David, and the last thing that he says to him before he dies. Okay, so these are some of his last words. This is a godly king encouraging his son. So that's what we're going to see today. So go ahead and flip over to 1 Kings chapter 2, and we'll begin here in verse 1. It says this: When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So this is a dad's final advice for his son, okay? He says, show yourself a man, or what we might actually say today would be more like, act like a man. Man up. It's time for you to do that. Now, what does it mean to act like a man? You know, that's something that we say sometimes, man up, right? What does that mean? Well, the Hebrew word that's used there is the word ish. And that means basically like the way we would use it in English. You know, the word for man can mean several different things. This version has a tone of respect to it. Be a respectable man, not just mankind, like act like a human, or an adult, right? Act like an adult. He's saying act like a good man. The way that we would say, like, oh yeah, he was a good man, right? What do we mean when we say he was a good man? You know, there's this idea of respectability that goes along with that, right? He was a good man, right? You know, he's doing what a man is supposed to do, okay? But what is that? What is it that a man is supposed to do to be respectful? What does that look like? You know, our culture gives us some ideas. If you flip on the TV or cruise through the internet or whatever, you'll find all sorts of definitions of what it means to be a man. And what I did was I Googled it, you know, because I'm, you know, a deep scholar like that. And I wanted to see, like, on the surface, what's the first thing that comes up when you type in, what is a man? And the first thing that came up in my browser was from Quora, you know, that website where you type in questions and people answer it, and then they vote it. This was the highest voted answer to the question, what does it mean to act like a man? It says this, and this is edited for content. I didn't want to, you know, there's a couple inappropriate words in there in the original. So it says this: usually when people talk about acting like a man, they're talking about outdated, sexist stereotypes that really need to die. Like how boys don't cry. That one gets on my nerves. What are you crying? What a wuss. Be a man. Suck it up, princess. Or you know, when a group of guys relentlessly hits on a group of girls to the point where it could quite possibly be classified as sexual harassment. What do all too many people do? They just roll their eyes and they say, boys will be boys. There is no one way that men act. Sure, there are ways that certain groups of men tend to act, but once we take these tendencies and apply them as blanket generalizations across all mankind, we get problems. So what does it mean to act like a man? It means to act like an outdated, psychologically harmful, masculine ideal that should be left in the dust. That's my 2 cents. That's the top-rated answer on the internet for what it means to act like a man. Now, maybe I'm old-fashioned, maybe I'm biased, but when David said, Solomon, act like a man, I don't think that's what he was talking about. I don't think he was saying, you know, son, before I die, I want to let you know, make sure you hit on women until they're uncomfortable. I don't think that's what he was trying to get across there. You know, he wanted some things for his son. He wanted him to be a valuable person to society. He wanted him to be respectable. He wanted him to be a godly man. That's what he meant when he said act like a man. Good things. He wasn't implying bad things. And that starts here. If you're filling in your blanks this morning, here's your first fill in the blank. Good dads care about their kids' integrity. Good dads care about their kids' integrity. See, Solomon was about 15 years old at this time. And David is saying, you can't be an immature little boy now, Solomon. You got things that you got to do. You have a kingdom to run. You have responsibility. You have a God to serve. Okay, so you have to do these things and you have to do them well. You know, there's a similar Greek phrase that's used again by Paul. That's why we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16 today. So if you want to flip over there, we're going to break down what it means to have integrity according to that passage in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14. It says this: be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. Now there's a militaristic tone here in the language with what he's using there. Be watchful, stand firm, act like men, be strong, okay? So here's what we need to know about having integrity. We're kind of going to go through a couple of subpoints here. So here's your first subpoint. To have integrity, we are to pay attention. We have to pay attention. We cannot just be ignorant. We've talked before about the spiritual war that's constantly going on around us. Right? If you pay attention, you'll see what Satan, the enemy, is trying to accomplish around us. It's pretty clear, but you have to pay attention to it. Literally, we have this enemy that has his eye on us that's looking for opportunities to strike. Now, sometimes we like to pretend like he's not powerful. We like to pretend like he's not trying. Some of us like to pretend like Satan isn't even there at all. But he is, and he's watching for opportunities to come after us. To pretend like he's not there is just plain foolish. Plato said this, not like the stuff that kids play with, but Plato, I used to always be confused by that. Like, why was his name Plato? Anyway. Better to be unborn than untaught, for ignorance is the root of misfortune. When I used to work in the paper mill, and I know I have a lot of paper mill stories, but here's another one. We have these big machines called pulpers, and basically, it's something, I don't know, it's probably 20 feet across. It's a giant blender, okay? And, old cardboard gets dumped into this blender, mixed with water, and there's big blades at the bottom that spin and grind it into pulp, and then you pump it out and make paper out of it. Well, there was the number 3 pulper was all the way at the end of the deck, so you didn't really see it too often. You had to get up and intentionally go look at it. And it worked different than the other ones. When the other ones would get a little thin, you could just press a button and then it would knock some paper in there real quick. This one ran really, really slow. The conveyor was just crawling up that thing. And so to stand there, you'd actually have to hold the switch and lean and just wait for this thing to just run and run and run and run, and finally you get enough paper in there. So it was really annoying to have to do this all the time. So somebody had the clever idea of getting a piece of wire, and they bent it up so that you could put it on the switch, and you could walk away, and it'll hold the switch running. So I don't know if you can see where I'm kind of going with this, but one day somebody was ignorant as to what was going on. They put the wire on the switch, and they let it run, and they walked away, and they didn't come back for hours. I think they actually fell asleep. And all of a sudden, they woke up because they heard, well, something's going on. Something's wrong with the number 3 pulper. So he ran over there and looked, and basically, if you think about it, all this paper is being dumped into this thing, and it's, 50 feet tall, so it's quite a bit of paper that's been stacked in there, and it's too heavy to break it down, and it's taking up too much space, so they can't really add water into it, so there's just dry paper trying to be ground up. It took them 2 days to finally break that down and pull all the paper out with the crane. It just took a long time. Why did that happen? It's pretty simple. He wasn't paying attention. It was slowly running and slowly adding more paper, but it was too fast for the pulper to keep up with, and it just kept running and running and running and running, and in the end, he got in big trouble for that. So if you think about it, that's kind of the way that Satan works. He lets it run slowly and slowly and slowly. So if you're looking at it, it's I don't really see a whole lot going on, and so you get comfortable, you fall asleep, and next thing you know, the enemy has accomplished a lot more than we realized. Because while we're sleeping, the enemy likes to set up his camp, waiting to catch us. Okay, so we should be watching. 2 weeks ago, the Saturday before last, we had our men's breakfast, and we sat and we talked around, and I asked each guy what their generation brought into the world as sin, because I think sometimes we think our own generation is great, and we look at other generations and we're critical, and each generation had a list of things that their generation was responsible for, whether it was encouraging drug culture or sex becoming normal on TV, or racism or whatever it was. Everyone's generation had these issues that have been brought in, and it's funny because it's a slow process. It's a slow fade. And each individual thing, it just seems like a minor issue, but when you look at it through history, you can see over decades, sin just becomes more and more normalized to us. We become more and more comfortable being around it. It's the frog in the kettle situation, where it just slowly adds more and you don't realize how far you've actually come. Here's the next thing we need to know about integrity. Number 2, to have integrity, we stand firm in the faith. Okay, part of this is recognizing that Christ has power in our lives, right? We put faith in him because we trust that he is doing good things and that he is powerful. Galatians 5:1 tells us, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Right? Stick in this godly lifestyle. Don't just go back to your old sinful life. Pursue godly things. Have faith and trust Jesus. And don't do everything yourself. If you don't have integrity, you can start slipping into some bad things. You end up with problems like legalism, or judgment or pride or guilt. And all of these things come by not putting your faith in God. You put your faith somewhere else, in yourself or society or whatever. But see, we're supposed to be free. Not free to sin, but free from sin. We're no longer under that bondage anymore, and so we should live that way. We should live having faith that all the stuff that we're really worried about has been taken care of. The bad stuff is already handled. Wow. I don't know what I'm doing this morning. That's my facial hair hitting the mic, I think. All right, I'm going to pop this out a little bit, see if that's any better. All right, and I'm not going to move the whole rest of the sermon either. To have integrity, we must be strong. Stand firm. Good advice. Where'd you hear that? Okay, here's your third one. To have integrity, we must be strong, okay? Now, when we think of good attributes about a man, oftentimes, strength is usually the first thing on the list, right? Well, what does it take to be a man? Be strong. Got to be strong. And that makes sense. It makes sense that strength is an attribute, a good attribute for a man. Scripture tells us over and over and over again to be strong. Joshua 1, Psalm 27, Ephesians 6, 2 Timothy 2, right? Be strong. We're told to be strong. It's a virtue. It's a good thing. But how do you define strength? What does godly strength look like? Are you only a man if you play football? Are you only a man if you own a gun? Are you only a man if you drink whiskey? Are you only a man if you've been to jail? Right? Those things don't define a man. When we think about what's a typical man, it's like me eat raw meat, me drag women by hair to cave, right? We think that's what it takes to be a man. I fight you with big stick, right? Things like that. I'm a man. No, if that's who you are, you're not a man, you're an animal. That's more animalistic than it is manly. When I'm at home and I have my head buried in my food and I'm eating really fast and I'm breathing really loud and I have rice stuck in my beard and I look at my wife, she doesn't turn to me and go, "You're just such a man." My wife looks at me and says, "You're like a beast. What's wrong with you?" Right? So it's so we think of these things as manly, but actually they're animalistic is what they are. Okay? So to be strong, that means that you do the right thing when it's hard. It means that you defend the weak. It means that you put other people first and you sacrifice your own needs. That's what it means to be a man of integrity. And then God goes on, or Paul, when he's writing, inspired by God, says, here's your fourth one, to have integrity, we must love. Okay, love is 100% about putting other people first. That's what love is. It's not just a feeling, oh, I just love being around you, I love you. Love means that you are intentionally sacrificing self for the betterment of other people. That's what love is. John 15:13 says, greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. When Jesus wanted to run love to his extreme, he said, give up your life. It's about laying things down, right? Including laying all of it down. So that's what love looks like, is self-sacrifice. So really, when someone says man up, it means you have integrity. It means you're not ignorant. It means you're not proud. It means you're not weak. And it means you're not selfish. That's what it means to be a man of integrity. So let's head back to 1 Kings, and we'll see what else David says to Solomon. So after David says, be strong and show yourself a man, he goes on, he says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways. So here's the next thing we learn. Good dads are concerned about their kids' relationship with God. Good dads are concerned about their kids' relationship with God. See, we want our kids to walk with God. We want our kids to love God. Darlene Schacht said, if we don't teach our children who God is, someone else will teach them everything that he isn't. Think about parenting. What is the idea of parenting? Really, we're trying to steer our kids in a certain direction, and we're really battling against, two different forces. When our kids do something that they shouldn't do, we either A, discipline them, or B, we let them slide. Now, both of those things are actually good, right? When a child is wrong, we correct them by distributing a punishment. They learn that bad things happen when you do bad things, right? Proverbs 13:24 tells us, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him, okay? So discipline is a good thing. God tells us we should discipline our children. Or he says, show them grace and mercy. In Matthew 19:14, I'm going to read from the King James Version here. It says, "But Jesus said, 'Suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven.'" That word suffer there doesn't mean torture your kids and make them suffer, right? I'm going to make my little children suffer. Don't worry about that one. I got that taken care of. That's not what that means. The idea of suffering means to accept or to tolerate. Like you suffer them. I will sit here and I will suffer what they put me through in a way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean extreme torture, but it means that you will tolerate it, that you will absorb what it means. It requires patience to allow kids to be kids. How often does Jesus teach us about grace in Scripture? Right? So our kids need both grace and discipline from us, but there is a balance that we have to strike. We're trying to find a balance between the two. I remember when I got my pilot's license a few years ago, several years ago, I got back from a flight. I landed, and we were going to taxi around. We were doing touch and goes, which you land, you take back off, and you go around. But I had landed, and I turned to my instructor, and I said, "Jeff, can I be done for the day, man? I'm exhausted." He's like, "Well, what's wrong? Like, did you not get enough sleep? Or like, you feeling sick? What's wrong?" I was like, "No, man, I was just fighting the airplane the whole time." He's like, "You were fighting the airplane?" I said, "Yeah, I was just constantly having to hold pull the yoke back and hold it back." And he goes, "Okay, taxi back to the runway." I was like, dang it, he's going to teach me some lesson in endurance or something. Like, I really don't want to do this. And so, we take off and, leave the pattern, and we're flying north, and he goes, "How do you feel?" I was like, "I'm still fighting the airplane. Like, my arms are getting tired from pulling this thing back." And he says, "Did you trim out the airplane?" Nope, I sure did not. Now, most of us in here probably don't know what it means to trim out an airplane. If you look at an airplane's elevators there, you have a trim tab, okay? That back elevator goes up and down, and that's what makes your plane, nose up or nose down as you're flying. But there's this little trim tab that you control with a wheel that looks like that. And what that does is it sets it so that it's giving your surface a control command without moving all the time. So if you have to constantly pull back, if you pull that thing, it pulls back a little bit for you, so it maintains level flight, so you don't have to sit there and hold back on this yoke the whole time. You can relax and kind of let it go and just trim it out, and it'll maintain flight generally for you. It saves your strength. It makes it a lot easier. And so what you do is you look out into the horizon or look at your gauges and make sure that you're, maintaining level flight, and you tune it so that you're maintaining level flight, okay? So that makes a lot of sense that you would do that, right? Well, that's also what we're supposed to be doing with our kids, is we are continually trying to find this balance so that we're pointing them in the right direction. See, if we mistrim our kids, they have to fight against everything that you've conditioned them to do in order to do things right. If you just look at, like if I sat in the cockpit and was like, I feel like that's going to be good. It may not be. You may end up just, climbing the whole time and fighting your airplane the whole time, because you're just going based on feeling in the cockpit. You have to look at the horizon. You have to look at where you're going and say, I'm trying to get there. So I'm going to make sure that I tune this up so that that's basically what I'm doing. That's what we're supposed to do with our kids. Enough discipline and enough grace so that they are pointed in that straight line, so that they are continually going at the horizon. But what is the horizon? What is the target that our kids are pointed at? It's God. We're constantly tuning them so that they are pursuing exactly towards God. We want to maintain that steadiness for them. See, oftentimes we instruct our kids and our eyes are not on the horizon. Our eyes are on other things. We're looking in the cockpit. We're looking at ourselves. We're worried about how we feel. We overpunish because we're angry, because we want vengeance more than we want correction. We think, well, you know what? That's how I grew up, so that's how you're going to grow up too. Or we let everything slide because we feel guilty. We think that it's our responsibility to give them this ideal childhood of nothing but ice cream and trampolines. And it's like, that's what we should be doing, but you're not pointing them in the right direction. Or we think, well, I messed up as a kid, so I have to let them repeat every mistake I ever did, and I'm not going to say a word. Our eyes should be set on the horizon and pointing our kids towards God, giving them enough of what they need in both categories. Because we don't want our kids just to have good jobs or to behave themselves or to be rule followers. We want our kids to grow into godly adults, and so we trim them up so it's easier for them to get where they're trying to go. Because when they know God and they love God, then they'll care about the next part. Here's the next thing that David pointed out to Solomon. Good dads teach their kids about God's rules. Good dads teach their kids about God's rules. That's why David says, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. See, as I already said, a relationship with God is important. But if you have a relationship with God, then you will not only follow God's rules, but you will actually love God's rules. I remember when I was a kid, I was probably 7, I was playing checkers with my dad, but we were playing special checkers. It was a game that I designed. It's like, hey, Dad, I came up with all these rules, and as we were playing the game, I kept remembering all these rules I forgot to tell him. By the way, Dad, I'm allowed to go sideways. I forgot to tell you that. By the way, Dad, I'm allowed to take my pieces back whenever I want to. I forgot to tell you that. And at the end of the game, if you can believe it, I won. You know who didn't have a good time playing that game? My dad, the guy who didn't know the rules at the beginning, right? Like, rules are a good thing. Having boundaries, guidelines, guideposts where we can navigate our lives, knowing that we don't go outside of those unsafe boundaries, that makes our lives better. Knowing the rules is actually a good thing. 1 John 2:4-5 says, whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. See, the love of God shows up when we have these rules and we love them and we want to follow them. Because we love God, we want to please him, and so we obey him. We know him and we trust him, and so we obey him. Okay, and then David goes on and he says that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. See, David had a general desire for his son to obey God, but he also had a specific reason he wanted him to obey God. That if all the kings maintained their obedience with God, they would always have a king on the throne in Israel forever. Now, in some ways, that didn't work. I don't know if you know this, but there is no king on the throne of Israel today. Right? The last king that, besides the one I'm going to tell you about in a minute, was a guy named Zedekiah. He caved into Nebuchadnezzar somewhere in the 6th century BC. But he wasn't the last king ever. There was another king that would come later who was a relative of King David. In John 7:42, it tells us this. Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? See, today we still have a Davidic king on the throne. His name is Jesus. Which is interesting because in the passage we just read, there's a command, right? As long as these kings are obedient to me, there will always be a king on the throne. And we know that those kings weren't obedient, and yet God still fulfilled his promise. He gave us an eternal king on the throne named Jesus. So God still follows through with his promises, even if we don't. But there's something in here that I think is important that we know. Remember, he says, I really want you to do this, Solomon, because God's going to fulfill his promise. So here's the last thing that we learn. Good dads want God's will for their kids. Good dads want God's will for their kids. See, David wants his son and all the kings after him to seek God. That way the promises will be fulfilled. Now, you might be thinking, this doesn't apply to me. Solomon obviously had a special promise, right, to be king and to have kings follow him. But God does promise us something very similar in Matthew 6:33. Jesus says this, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. That promise is, if you seek God first, everything else will be okay. If you trust God and his will, everything will be okay in your life. Put him first, he will handle the rest. And that's why godly dads want their kids to trust God, because that's the best place to be, to live a life where you're trusting God and not just yourself. To trust God enough to do things his way, to be taken care of by him. But there is one more thing I want to add about dads here. Good dads model these things for their kids. Good dads model these things for their kids. They don't just sit back and keep their mouth shut, do as I say, not as I do, and let them go. A good dad wants to model what it looks like to be a Christ follower for their children. Kids don't develop character. They don't put their trust in God, and they don't obey his commandments in a vacuum. Right? Kids will replicate what they see. Proverbs 22:6 tells us, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. That teaching kids when they're little will have an effect on them for the rest of their lives. So dads, what kind of dad do you want to be? I mean, do you want people to look at your son and say, man, you got a mean slider. Where'd you learn how to throw like that? My dad. You know, man, you grill a killer steak. Learned it from my dad. Man, you rebuilt that 350 from the block up just like that? My dad taught me that. I mean, those are good things, right? But is that really the legacy you want to give to your children? I mean, what if somebody came up to them and said, wow, you know what, you're a man of integrity, just like your dad was. Wow, girl, you always do the right thing, just like your dad. Man, you know the Bible through and through. How did you learn it like that? My dad. We read together. We prayed together. He loved me. What legacy do you want to leave, Dad? When you look back at your life and you look back at the way that you raised your kids, what do you want to be the thing that shines through? Is it all the baseball games you went to and stuff like that, or is it going to be that you taught your kids what it looks like to be a Christ follower and that they wanted to replicate that in their lives?